The Kabul airport, where U.S. troops are scrambling to fly Americans and allies out of the country. At least 3,200 diplomats and civilians have been evacuated from Afghanistan on military flights so far.
Our mission in Afghanistan was never supposed to have been nation building.
But anyone trying to get to the airport has to pass through Taliban.
The UK has said it will take 20,000 Afghan refugees over a number of years.
The past 2 weeks in Afghanistan have been extraordinary.
It was never supposed to be creating a unified, centralized democracy.
The Taliban have gone from controlling no cities to controlling the entire country.
My name's Joseph Spada, and this is the McGill International Review. In today's episode, I'm joined by Christopher Preble, the co-director for the New American Engagement at the Atlantic Council. Christopher is also the former vice president at the Cato Institute for Defense and Foreign Policy Studies. We discuss many of the limitations of military intervention in the Iraq and Afghanistan conflicts. Okay, so one of the main questions that I wanted to ask you was the Afghanistan war and even the Iraq war ultimately decided within the first few months and years of our initial invasion?
Sure. So I generally don't think that either the wars in Iraq or Afghanistan were mostly failures because of flawed execution. I think that there were some sort of core assumptions to both conflicts that likely would not have been resolved even by very different policies. But I think, first of all, I think it's necessary to separate the two because these are two very, very different countries, and the set of circumstances explaining U.S. entry into what effectively was the Afghan Civil War and the U.S. decision to overthrow Saddam Hussein in 2003 and thus precipitate a civil war in Iraq or deepen a civil war in Iraq. I think the conditions were very, very different. So in the case of Afghanistan, I think that the initial mission to dislodge the terrorist training camps and al-Qaeda safe havens inside of Afghanistan, the decision to remove from power the Taliban government that had harbored al-Qaeda, and then to install a different government, a more pro-Western, relatively secular government in the place of the Taliban. I think a lot of those were accomplished in the first few months of that operation. Now, with some important exceptions, of course, bin Laden and the other senior al-Qaeda leaders did manage to escape. We now know several of them escaped into Pakistan because, of course, that's ultimately where bin Laden was killed. But the other core objects of that campaign were achieved in the first few months. Even the standing up of the government under Hamid Karzai, that had some base of support inside of Afghanistan, not as deep or as durable as we would have liked, but I think it's possible that government could have survived with some, if some other decisions had been made along the way. And again, we can get into that a bit more. But I do think that the effort beyond that would almost certainly have failed, in the sense that there just wasn't sufficient support especially outside of the key urban areas for the Karzai government. And I think, and for subsequent governments, most recently the government under Ashraf Ghani. So I think there were some conditions in Afghanistan that would have made it extremely difficult under even the best set of circumstances for a central government to have established control. And again, one of the great ironies, we have to remember the Taliban didn't control all of Afghanistan in September of 2001. The Taliban was constantly fighting with, mostly based on ethnic and tribal ethnic differences, in a sense that the mostly Pashtun Taliban were not sufficiently sort of interested in the rights of the Northern Alliance, the Uzbeks, Hazaras, and things like that. Tajiks. So the Afghanistan case is the Iraq case. I think the Iraq case is very, very different. I know the argument that had the United States made different decisions in April and May of 2003, after Saddam Hussein had been driven from power. Of course, he wasn't found until the end of 2003, but he was clearly driven from power. The Ba'ath Party was driven from power. But I think that notwithstanding the decision to disband the army and to institute a de-Baathification program that affected sort of the middle tier of middle and in some cases even the lower tiers of sort of the Iraqi professional class, that wouldn't have solved the problems that we ultimately encountered in Iraq. There's a couple different ways to look at this. For one thing, a number of the Sunni minority who had been protected and enjoyed a privileged existence under Saddam Hussein's rule, they would not have sort of willingly gone along with a subordinate status under a Shiite-dominated government and allied with the Kurds in the north. They knew the good life under Saddam Hussein, and many of them would have resisted fiercely, wanting to get back what was taken from them. I feel pretty strongly about that. I think what's ironic, of course, is the research that the U.S. government did prior to going into Iraq. Many Iraq experts predicted this exactly. And even in the intelligence community, for all the focus on the intelligence community's failure to correctly assess the state of the Iraqi nuclear weapons program and other weapons programs, and that was a failure on the part of the U.S. intelligence community. The U.S. intelligence community predicted almost with perfect clairvoyance the disintegration of the Iraqi state and the inability of a Shiite-dominated government to be able to put down a Sunni insurgency without great violence in the course, and that's ultimately what happened, of course. So the flip side of that argument that had the United States retained the Iraqi army pretty much as it was, if the U.S. had allowed the members of the Ba'ath Party to retain their government positions, whether they were teachers or administrators or bureaucrats or whatnot, you still had a Shiite majority that had been oppressed for decades under the Baathists, including under Saddam Hussein, who wanted vengeance on these people that had controlled them and worse, of course, visited horrible crimes and abuses against the Shiite majority for decades. So I think that was always a challenge for this U.S. nation building mission. And ultimately, we discovered that the United States and others just couldn't square that circle. The Shiite majority, and again, with the cooperation of the Kurdish minority, was able to take power, but was not willing to share that power with the Sunni minority, and the Sunni minority was not willing to endure permanent minority status and feared correctly that they might now be the victims of a campaign of intimidation and violence against them, which is again tragically exactly what happened.
Yeah. So just building off of what you were just talking about in Iraq, I understand that there was this since the Sunni population were the ones benefiting the most from Saddam's regime. I'm just wondering if, like, the vengeance aside, was it when the U.S. initially invaded Iraq and we destroyed a lot of the infrastructure and there wasn't the basic necessities such as electricity, access to clean water, and
yes,
basic security needs were not met. And so I guess my next question is, if there was less of an emphasis on military occupation and more on traditional diplomacy, is there perhaps a lesson to be learned about how about the limitations of military intervention?
Yes, I think both. I think both cases, both in Iraq and Afghanistan, it is a lesson in the limits of military intervention, because and an equal sort of ignorance of politics, right? I mean, so countries have politics, even if they're not democracies. There are politics. There are political constituencies who expect a government to protect them from harm, to be able to provide basic services in exchange for the citizens' fealty, sort of conceding the government certain authority over them, right? And if the government doesn't provide those things, then there's going to be resistance, and in some cases, violent resistance. And it all comes down to how confident are the people in their ability to provide these things for themselves, or if they are convinced that the government's own abuses against them constitute such a grave threat to their well-being that their only recourse is violent resistance. And I think, again, you saw that in both Iraq and in Afghanistan. Again, the cases are very, very different. Iraq is a much more urban society, again, mostly focused in Baghdad. I think Baghdad constitutes something like 25% of the population of Iraq all by itself. So you just have a much higher concentration of people in the urban areas, whereas the geography and the sort of cultural conditions inside of Afghanistan are very decentralized, and authority is very local, right? This is not this tolerance of outsiders imposing authority on local villages and whatnot. But I do think that speaks to the challenge for any foreign army that is attempting to impose order in a foreign place. And again, this is not unique to the United States and Afghanistan. This goes back, for centuries or longer. And one of the challenges that the United States encountered is when a foreign army is trying to protect a foreign government and invest that government with the authority, commanding the authority of the constituents, it paradoxically undermines the authority of that government, because it is in fact a foreign occupying army. And again, many Americans struggle with that concept, and I understand why that is. Because we're not occupiers. The Soviet Red Army occupied East Germany, but the United States didn't occupy West Germany in the Cold War, right? Because we were there by invitation, as the argument goes. And there's quite a bit of truth to that. But still, the fact remains that it is extremely difficult for the indigenous government, even with the best of intentions and a very sort of capable, credible, professional government, to wean itself from the foreign military's protection, right? I mean, and so there's this real catch-22. And again, it's not unique to Afghanistan and Iraq. Vietnam is another classic case, but there are many others. And so I think one of the lessons from the last 20 years is a reminder of the limits of military power. A military is quite capable still quite capable at killing people and breaking things, but it really isn't capable of investing a local government with legitimacy. That has to come from the government in question, and ultimately, if that government isn't afforded that respect by the people that it seeks to govern, it's just not going to work. It's not going to function.
Right. So that's sort of something that I found in my own research. Was we were pursuing this strategy of like winning hearts and minds of the Afghan people, and so you made some very good points there, and I just want to follow up with those. Specifically, there was the traditional U.S. military presence there, but then also there was the Afghan special forces, the security forces, these private contractors, often called mercenaries, um, operating within Afghanistan, and oftentimes with lack of oversight. And so, as you were saying, a lot of the Afghan government didn't necessarily have the respect from the people or the consent to govern. And
Right.
I'm wondering how specifically the lack of oversight and perhaps the US military and specifically the Pentagon may have turned a cold shoulder to some of the operations that the Afghan security forces were carrying out, specifically the night raids. There's accusations of war crimes, acting as death squads in certain areas,
Yes.
retaliation, and just building off of that, it appeared that in the reflections that I've read of the Afghan conflict, the locals, specifically in the rural areas, were put in a sort of quagmire where if they helped U.S. forces, the Taliban would retaliate towards them, and vice versa.
Yeah, I mean it's a classic catch-22, right? It's a conundrum. The challenge is in again, I think this is a lot of it has to do with a foreign army, a foreign military occupying a certain place. When that is the case, even when that army acts with extraordinary care to avoid collateral harm, civilian casualties, etc., there always will be accidents. There will be incidents where a bomb goes astray, a tracer round is ricochets, and horrible incidents like that. You have incidents where the intelligence is poor, and you hit the exact house that you're intending to hit, but it turns out that the intelligence on whether or not that house was a safe house for bad guys or a safe house for good guys, that can turn out to be wrong. So you just as Clausewitz famously called it, the fog of war. These incidents are inevitable, and then you have the incidents that are not accidents but are actual abuses, war crimes, where individual units or individuals just down to the unit level commit horrific crimes, and they need to be held accountable. I think there is a tendency when a foreign army is working with local partners to want to excuse or look past some of those abuses on the logic that, well, the alternative is worse, right? That if this unit carries out some attack, some reprisal, if it is less discriminating in who gets caught up in the violence, the argument will be, well, the other side will be even worse, and it won't be a matter of just being not as discriminating, but they will actually consciously attempt, they're not going to obey the laws of war. They're going to actually go out of their way to inflict grievous harm on civilians to send a message, right? But you just can't control for all of those cases. And so again, this is a reminder precisely why war is a blunt instrument, why violence of all types has a tendency to get out of control. And again, it's not the fault of the U.S. military at all, or even the U.S. government. Maybe it wasn't exerting adequate oversight of the various contractors operating in the country. When those incidents were brought to light, some of them were investigated, some people were punished, but not everyone was, and it really depends on the cases. To me, it comes back to just the challenge that the military is a blunt instrument, and there are going to be unintended consequences of of organized violence, even when it's by, arguably the most professional military on the earth.
Right. It looked like, from what I could tell, there was a lot of instances where they would investigate, a lot of other ones where they would
Yes.
maybe not look into it as deeply as they could to preserve the alliances that we created, specifically the Northern
Correct.
Alliance. I guess I've read some papers that argue that a lot of the subgroups within the Northern Alliance sort of had a unofficial like bandwagoning policy where they're taking the side of whichever actor was winning at the moment. And
Yes.
turning towards 2020, 2019, did it seem as if the support, if this bandwagoning was switching from, or I guess what I'm asking is, there has been within the Taliban recruitment, there's been, initially it was just Pashtuns, but eventually it appeared that more and more groups within Afghanistan were joining the Taliban. Is that
right? And again, yes, I think it's true. I think the evidence is that groups that had in the past resisted and fought against the Taliban, going back to prior to 2001, concluded that that it would be better for them to make a deal with the Taliban than to resist them. And again, this is a moving target. This story is ongoing, and there's likely to be pockets of resistance, and how the Taliban deals with those pockets of resistance, whether they do it by co-opting them or buying them off or bribing them, or do they do it by attempting to extinguish them by violence.
Right.
But people are called warlords for a reason. Right. And if they have a certain sense of their what is essential to their survival, and that is a combination of an ability to resist and defend themselves against violence. It's also contingent upon their ability to command the respect or rally the support of whoever is under their control. Right. Whoever is within their particular zone of control. And again, some warlords do this by excruciating violence and intimidation and coercion. Others do it by are more involved diplomacy and compromise and a more traditional political approach, right, where you're generating the support of locals and sustaining it in a sort of traditional political way. It appears that many of these warlords concluded that it was in their best interest to cut a deal with the Taliban as opposed to attempt to resist them. And part of the calculus is, we know this, is part of the calculus is because they had grave doubts about whether the alternative, the Ghani government, would also protect them or allow them to continue, or whether the Ghani government or any other government in Kabul, in fact, represented an intolerable threat that they had no other choice in their mind but to resist, right? And so that may explain. I mean, again, we have to remember the Taliban was making pretty steady gains over a period of a number of years, going back 2015, 2016, where you see the amount of territory that was at least contested by the Taliban and some actually controlled by. Mm-hmm. Was actually growing, and so they had figured out some combination of negotiations and bribes and concessions, along with intimidation and violence, to secure this territory and to grow the territory under their control.
Right. Yeah. As well, I think in that during the peace negotiations, I believe something like 5,000 Taliban prisoners were released that I imagine to contribute to them being able to gain more territory and influence.
Right, because those people who were released from prison knew who was responsible for that, right? Those individuals many of whom were certainly criminals, but some of whom were more like political prisoners, or again, insurgents who were resisting the authority of the central government. Those people had a sort of built-in loyalty to the Taliban, who liberated them from prison.
Right.
And so that certainly helped the Taliban to expand their control.
Yeah. So the last question I wanted to ask you is a bit of a broader question, but so I'm wondering, I think most people would agree that the capturing senior Al-Qaeda members, and perhaps some would even argue that overthrowing the Taliban government was vital to the United States' national interest. What I'm wondering is, was it in our national interest to stay for as long as we did and to reconstruct or nation build in Afghanistan?
Well, no, I don't think it was in the U.S. core national interest to attempt to nation build in Afghanistan. And I don't say that merely because it obviously failed and the effort was obviously failing for some number of years. These things don't collapse in the matter of a few weeks if they actually were succeeding over the course of the previous 20 years. So there was something rotten in the heart of Denmark, so to speak, right? And that was quite obvious. And again, what's so frustrating is it was obvious to many people for a number of years, right? There, the most important of which is the Special Inspector General for Afghan Reconstruction was issuing these reports constantly, documenting the corruption, documenting the mismanagement, documenting that the claims of steady progress were false, deliberate sort of distortions of the facts on the ground. And so that's frustrating. Another element of this that's frustrating is the assumption has been for some time that the Taliban is sort of inextricably connected to Al-Qaeda and also has sort of transnational designs, transnational terrorism designs, where the reality may be, and we'll find out here over the course of the next several months or years, that they really are focused on Afghanistan. That doesn't mean we need to like the nature of the government that they institute in Afghanistan, but they may not pose a threat even to their neighbors, let alone countries 6,000 or 7,000 or 8,000 miles away, that we assumed they did in 2001, right? And we now know that an offer was made to the Bush administration sometime late in 2001, when it was obvious that the Taliban were going to be driven from power, something along the lines of an offer of to stop fighting, to have the Taliban leader Mullah Muhammad Omar under something like a house arrest. That was rejected. The Bush administration rejected that, said, there would be no negotiations with the Taliban under any circumstances, because the notion that the Taliban would have any representation or involvement in the Afghan government after December of 2001 or January 2002 was just off the table, right? They just rejected that out of hand. And so again, I think in retrospect, we can say, gee, in light of all the effort that was expended here, the lives lost, especially Afghan lives lost, the potentially the perpetuation of a decades-long war for 2 more decades on the people of Afghanistan, if knowing what we know now, we could have avoided that, would that have been better for U.S. national security? Would that have been better even for the people of Afghanistan? I'm sorry to say that I think the answer is yes. But again, this is not just hindsight bias, right? This is not just looking back and saying, well, knowing what we know now, because I think that the core object of going into Afghanistan in the first place was achieved in the first several months of those operations, and to dislodge Al-Qaeda and to send a message, in effect, not just to the Taliban, but to any other government on the planet that might contemplate welcoming Al-Qaeda or other transnational terrorist groups like Al-Qaeda that they would pay a very steep price. And that message was delivered loud and clear in November and December of 2001.
Right. I think that's a very crucial to reemphasize that we've known that it's been a failing war for over a decade, or
Yes.
at least a decade.
Yes. Yes, correct.
And so I'm wondering, in your opinion, if you think that U.S. foreign policy has an opportunity to perhaps pivot towards focusing on vital national security interests rather than attempting to nation build, or do you think we're sort of prone to this?
Well, I certainly think that President Biden is quite clear that he wants to focus U.S. Military operations on vital national interests, and he's been quite explicit on this point. And that's not unique to him. We've had episodes in U.S. history where others have, usually after a setback, concluded that the United States needs to focus on core vital interests. We call it the Weinberger-Powell Doctrine, first after Caspar Weinberger, Ronald Reagan, Secretary of Defense, mostly after the Beirut bombing, the Marine barracks bombing in Beirut, a sense that the United States has sort of lost its way. Then, then the Weinberger-Powell Doctrine, where Colin Powell, after the Gulf War, was really trying to focus the U.S. military and to narrow the range of missions that would be imposed on a U.S. military that he anticipated correctly was going to shrink coming out of the Cold War. He didn't want to see that army, a smaller army having more missions. So he was trying to define and sort of prioritize and narrow. And I think now that's what President Biden is trying to do. I think the additional challenge for traditional national security professionals and senior U.S. leaders is that the scope of national security threats is actually widening, right? It's not getting narrower, it's actually growing. And so it's even harder, but also more important to set priorities, because you truly can't do all of these things simultaneously. You can't just take the list of things that we've been wanting to deal with over the years and just add onto the list, a bunch of other things and say, we're going to do all of these things equally well. That's not realistic. And so I think that President Biden is trying to focus on a smaller sort of focus on a certain set of challenges that he sees as the most urgent and the most important, and then of necessity downplay other things that have traditionally been sort of dominating our attention over the last 20 years. We'll see how successful he is. Yeah. I think one thing that I think that there is broad public support for focusing on sort of rebuilding at home in order to make the United States stronger abroad. And so I think he's pushing on an open door there that could actually benefit him politically, as well as ultimately put the United States in a stronger position to prevail in the future.
That concludes my conversation with Christopher Preble. For more from the McGill International Review, be sure to follow us on Spotify and visit our webpage at mironline.ca. Thanks for listening.